everyone, and welcome back to As If, a contemporary art podcast with me, Lisa Fevral. Today, I want to talk about zines, what zines actually are, and why they are a type of medium that you should look into if you are a small artist. By small, I mean new, young, starting out, or you are not in major galleries, you're not promoted or have representation with big galleries or whatever. So most people, if you are interested in making art, zines could be a way for you to be making art that is tangible, that is physically in this world, but at the same time it's not going to completely decimate your bank account. Something that you could monetize if you want to, and something that has a really, really rich history. A zine is basically kind of like a magazine, but they're usually made in very small batches. By small, I mean like definitely under 1,000 copies. Some zines that were very, very popular, they were selling about 3,000 copies sometimes, but overall, zines are usually very, very small batch. They're usually more local than international, but nowadays I feel like it could be possible to sell your zines internationally as well. The point of today's podcast is to talk about a few artists that were very, very influential in the zine medium. Those artists, coincidentally, are also the artists that were very, very influential in the house music scene. So basically, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tidbit of information about both of those things today. And this topic today was inspired by me going to this exhibition. It's called Copy Machine Manifestos, and it is the first major museum exhibition dedicated to artist scenes in North America. So this exhibition, I actually saw a bunch of this oftentimes copy machine made works that were very popular with artists and activists, especially for punk and street culture, conceptual, queer, and feminist art, all of those. The artists that were in that exhibition, some of them are very, very famous, like Vaginal Davis. I'm sure you've heard. Actually, probably you haven't, because I feel like zines can be one of those art mediums that go under the radar when it comes to just like regular art history curriculum, when it comes to people not studying art history in particular, but just kind of like taking a couple of classes here and there just to broaden their horizons. I feel like this is the type of stuff that kind of gets overlooked. I'm pretty sure that this show is gonna also go on tour, so you might gonna be able to see it if you're like in America or something, because the thing is, the curators of this are from America. It is actually organized by the Brooklyn Museum and curated by Brandon Joseph and Drew Sawyer, curator of photography at the Whitney Museum. I have gone to like a little press conference and stuff like that where we could ask questions and chat about this in particular, because as you can tell by just simple definition of what zine magazines are, they were always preferred by people who are marginalized, because a lot of artists who aren't marginalized, they can get spots in galleries, they make money, they don't have to be worried about how they're going to disseminate their information. And a lot of the artists that we're going to be talking about today were marginalized folks, specifically Black queer creators from Chicago mostly. Obviously, like for example, RuPaul is not from Chicago or didn't make his works in Chicago at the time, but he was actually featured in one of the Thing zines, which is like a little bit of a fun little pop culture tidbit for you. The Thing zine was a thing at the end of 80s and beginning of 90s. And as you know, at the time, there was a really, really big issue that people were dealing with, which is the AIDS crisis. And it was so massive that if you're going to be looking into any artists of the time who were doing any work that was in any shape or form interesting and not just about like circle jerking, all of them were honestly queer. And at least like the ones that I like most from America at the time are all people who were queer. And all of them were dealing with a government that was basically happy about the epidemic rather than trying to stop it, because it was so prejudiced to the point where they were kind of excited about this whole wipeout of a whole demographic, which is horrific. But it is what it is. Like, I'm not going to be telling you that, oh, the government it was just mismanagement. Like, it wasn't mismanagement. It was on purpose, okay? There was a DJ, Robert Ford, and those two guys, Trent Atkins and Lawrence Warren, they were the ones who were working on Thing zine. Ford actually made zines before. One of them was Think Inc. And I think that there was only a couple of issues before Ford started working on Thing. And it was all happening in Chicago, a result of multiple things. First thing was the Great Migration of African Americans from the South America to the North after Civil War and after Civil Rights Movement and stuff like that, because the South, as you can imagine, based on just the things that we hear even nowadays, was not the most progressive place, let's say it that way. It was definitely hostile to anyone who wasn't into slavery, okay? Which would be any normal person, to be honest. But a lot of African Americans moved up because the North had more people who were, supporting abolition of slavery and other things like that, So it was a better place to live in basically for them. However, a lot of people moving to big cities affected the population with a lot of white folks who I would assume that this is also like race related in terms of racism related. I don't know for sure, but there was definitely a huge migration of white population to the suburbs. Specifically, we're talking about the 70s. The effect of it was felt, and there was a wave of disco music going on, which became quite mainstream, but was started again by the same people, a lot of black artists. Disco music, to me as a foreigner, it has never had like any negative connotations in terms of like more of a flamboyant style of clothes or whatever the hell. I mean, I guess I never really had a lot of negative feelings about anything that's not a complete reflection of who I am. So I didn't really, I never thought about it negatively, but like a lot of people who grew up in America are saying that there was this negative connotation to disco because of a lot of racist and a lot of homophobic people labeling disco as like not real music. It wasn't like rock enough or whatever the fuck, right? But at the same time, which is the funniest part, is that whenever a rock group, a white rock group, would adapt a disco sound, they would go platinum and they would get a lot of publicity off of that. So it wasn't the genre that was bothering everybody, or not everybody, but it was mostly just a lot of people who honestly were just like racist and homophobic. It was like a combo. It was so clear that there's a specific type of demographic that doesn't like disco, which is like 18 to 30-year-old white men in particular. That there was literally a group that was called Disco Ducks Clan. Anything that has clan in it and is in America is already making me sweat a little. Like, it's making me uncomfortable immediately. I don't even know what you guys are about, but I'm already suspicious. Sorry. They literally wanted to wear white cloaks, fill in the gaps, and they wanted to like burn records and whatever, right? So basically young male whites were really not happy about disco existing. They were really, really pissed about it. And there was this guy, and I'm not going to tell you his name because honestly, I purposefully didn't write it down because who gives a fuck? Like, I'm just going to make fun of him a little bit by saying that this guy who was working at a rock radio station that became a disco station because disco became more popular than rock was really pissed about it, basically being like, they took my job, disco is ass, whatever. His name is not important. What I'm going to tell you is he looked low-key like Shane Dawson, which is enough for you to, paint a picture. And he was so pissed about it that he incited a riot in 1979. So at the end of 70s, you've got this huge musical genre that was adapted by a lot of artists who were already popular and a lot of artists who were more palatable, by which I mean that even the racists would listen to them, so they were white. And this genre was attacked all of a sudden in 1979. Everyone ran out on this field, started burning records, and it was such a big thing that suddenly disco records would not sell anymore. So we've got this wave of creativity going on in the North because of a lot of marginalized people moving to places like Chicago. In Chicago, you get disco. Disco goes back and forth between different countries, like, for example, Italy. A lot of artists get inspired by each other, and then you get this sudden stop to disco music because there was just such an outpour of hatred, and it was all right-wing hatred. So very much fascist bullshit, So it was so in the open, while at the same time it was presented to a wider demographic as not specifically a race issue or something, to the point where everyone kind of stopped interacting with disco except for people who were the originators, obviously. And it's kind of strange that it even happened because obviously there's a lot of prejudice anyway, but it seems like if civil war like still managed to be won, there should be enough people who would be supporting disco regardless of this whole thing happening. But girl, I don't know. I don't know why it was such a sudden like stop to disco music, but after that, after 1979, you got the 80s happening, and 80s gave us house music. And house music came from Chicago, was created by the same artists who were in the disco scene, who were remixing everything and who were really into using samples of like big diva vocals from the disco era. So that's why there's like a lot of similarities in some regards with it, and it's hard to tell them apart if you're not familiar with music genres in general, and especially with different types of drum machines, so you could like differentiate which one is which, right? Because house music is famous for introducing Roland TR 909. It's like kind of like a DJ shit thing. I don't know, girl. It's like a mix. It's basically a bunch of samples that you could use, and or a bunch of different like sounds that are very specific to this particular machine. I mean, I could go into more detail, but I feel like most people are not going to give a fuck because this isn't a DJing podcast, so I'm not going to go into which sounds were on it in particular. But you have heard of a concept of using 808s as a drum machine, right? So that's kind of the same shit because it's the same guy created 808 machines, and then he was like, let me create 909s. So you've got a lot of people mixing music differently now. It's still all coming from the same underground artists. In the 80s, while all of this is happening with the music industry, at the end of the 80s, you get Thing Zine happening. So Thing Zine basically kind of memorialized what house music was at the time, because a lot of the people, again, who were working on this zine were people who were in that house music scene. Some of them were DJs, some of them were not really musicians in particular, but they were still involved in the clubs, in the art scene. They would be constantly hanging out at the clubs with fucking Andy Warhol for some reason. Andy Warhol was everywhere, wasn't he, eh? And basically what you get is this group of people who needed to speak on issues that affected them greatly, like affected them in such a huge, huge way, which is the queer community and the AIDS crisis. And you've got all of this art that has come out of that era that's kind of reflected in all of those zines, at the same time as those zines also presented a lot of works about sexuality. And obviously, for many people like myself who are not very sexual in general, like this works might not resonate with you because of that, but also because they're so specific to the time and place that it was made in, you know? There was works, for example, like this issue 2 that had very explicit sketches and poems, visual art, other things like that that were all about, for example, Thing issue number 2 was literally the sex issue. So it's obviously going to have a lot of topics discussed. And there is a very obvious reason why it was such a big topic and why it was so important for all of those artists to speak on sex in such an explicit way, right? The reason why it was so important is obviously because the AIDS crisis was so tightly tied to intercourse. There's literally no way of talking about the stigma that was around it, the reasons why people thought that they don't have to worry about it, and the way that it was spread, right? The whole idea of people thinking that it was only spread through sexual encounters and only through specifically queer sexual encounters was the reason why people thought that they didn't have to worry about it, especially because the population is obviously split in a way that an overwhelming majority is going to be straight, just statistically speaking, right? Now, a lot of these artists have given platforms and have given real critiques and wrote about a lot of artists who wouldn't get that recognition or that back and forth, or that academic, maybe not academic per se, but this artistic and critical take. They wouldn't get those takes on their works from anybody else. No one would interact with it with the same depth as these people did who wrote Zine, right? You would get some interviews, for example, that were written by the three main guys who wrote this zine, and you would get real interviews that talked about real things instead of a watered down version, or having no interviews written about you at all, where it would be very difficult for people to know about your art, understand your art, and etc., if there's no things like that available for them to look to. It's very, I have talked about why critics who write critiques on art are very important in previous episodes of this podcast, because it's very important to have these educated takes on art for the growth of artists, because having someone who is not prejudiced against you but has some education in art or some understanding of the arts in general, it's very important to have somebody who can do this type of work for you, where they look at your work from outside of you, or your immediate friend group, and they can give you some kind of, not even legitimacy per se, but they can give you actual well-developed feedback. This is the reason why these types of zines and whatever were very important, because first of all, they actually write down history from a different perspective, from a perspective of people who were living at the time, creating at the time, affecting culture in such a massive way, while at the same time not getting any fucking credit for it. Like, it's crazy to see how many artists created disco and how many disco songs that are actually super, super popular in the world are not even made by those people, even though they were at the top of the charts too. At the same time, it's crazy how prejudice affects like the lens through which we see who is the originator or the face of the movement or the face of the new genre or whatever. It's crazy, honestly. Not only that, but we have to also talk about the fact that a lot of these artists have created works that were not shown by any galleries because those galleries did not want anything to do with them. However, they reflected the time a lot better, and they reflected the human experience in general a lot more, and pushed the envelope and created new ways of creating art in a lot more effective ways than anybody else who was at the fucking galleries at the time. The fact that everyone knows about abstract expressionism more than about these guys is diabolical. Okay? I had a professor who really loves abstract expressionism and who loves Pollock and stuff like that, and I'm not an abstract art hater. I actually love abstract art. I just personally think that abstract expressionism was just like a marketing twist on abstraction that already happened in fucking Europe years and years ago. It's just crazy that so many people always need to market art that's already kind of been made this way before. They just have to market it in a different way so they can claim to have started something new, which doesn't make any sense. While at the same time, there were always people like this who were actually creating new genres and making new stuff, and they're just not as well known as Pollock and his goddamn cigarette, where he's like allowing the ash to fall into the paint. That's so crazy. He's so free and such a visionary. I'm sorry. Listen, I have learned about him from a perspective, oh my god, he's a genius, and I still don't agree. So I don't know what to tell you, bitch. Like, a lot of those artists who have contributed so much died very young. That's one of the things that are really sad about this, and they died from something that could have been prevented, something that was definitely made worse and unmanageable for years because of prejudice and because of the government just going. I don't even want to start myself on this because I'm going to be so pissed off, and you know how it is with me. But For example, this guy that I told you about, Ford, his last name is Ford, he died from complications related to HIV and AIDS at the age of only 32. That's how young. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. And he documented his declining health in a series of personal essays that were published in Plus magazine. I really like this quote from it where he says, escapism is fine on occasion, but investing an equal amount of energy into facing this thing and lending our support is what will ultimately make the difference. Call your friends who are positive to say hello. If you are positive and keeping it to yourself, tell somebody who cares about you and notice how the sun rises the next morning. When I went to this exhibition, I also saw this zine, Infected F-Word Perspectives, which was created by Wayne Carr and Corey Roberts Ollie. I took a picture of one of them. I think it was issue 12. And there's this page, page 4, where it goes, to all of you queens who thought I'd be gone by now, I'm not. So there. Didn't you know? Evil girls don't die young. We hang around while all the goodies go quick. Yes, you too can be pretty, live a long time, and have AIDS. Just look at me. It's just really funny the way that they were going about it. I mean, it's kind of tragic and funny, which is pretty on par with just how life is. Funny and tragic, you know? And I like this quote that's on the front of the zine that says, dedicated to keeping the realities of F-words living with AIDS and HIV disease in your face, in big letters, in your face, until the plague is over, which is honestly really fair because the fact that the authorities thought that they could just segregate this experience and be chill with it, it's just really weird and cruel and strange the way that people approach things. How people were just like, yeah, we can just wait this shit out, just let all of them die and it's okay. Like that was genuinely the thought process here, which is crazy. But I definitely enjoy going and like seeing this works because honestly a lot of exhibitions that I go to are quite toothless, especially mostly because oftentimes it is a bunch of people who are basically running really big businesses, right? Like the galleries and whatever, who are showing works that specifically show this experience that doesn't actually exist, which is they either show works that are from the past where they can go back, like look back, point at something that happened, like for example, the HIV crisis, and be like, that was bad, you guys. Like we should have handled it better. But then not actually existing in the now and trying to fix what we're doing wrong now, even though we know better, we still don't do better. It's always like this kind of weird loop where you go to an art gallery and they're showing something that is supposed to be a reflection of some kind of rebellion, and then they take out all the parts that actually criticize the things that are causing all of those problems, especially if it's supposed to be about a current issue. You will notice that if you go to, it's gonna basically, you know what? The perfect example of this is in pop culture. It's exactly what I've talked about when I talked about Jojo Siwa pretending to be some kind of revolutionary, as if she like as if she started a riot, as if she fought for, you know, gay rights or something like that. You know, like she's acting as if she is this revolutionary, when in reality, all she does is uphold the same systems that abuse people who are marginalized, because she is one of those token marginalized people who got to be on the side of the oppressor, and they're like, I kind of like it here, so I'm gonna continue on doing this shit on behalf of my people. Like I'm gonna be like, it's kind of like Taylor Swift type of feminism, white feminism, you know, where you go, I can also be a war criminal, you know, women can also bomb, we can also send bombs over to places where we don't live, like we can do this, we're just like the guys, you know, when in reality we should be dismantling this whole fucking thing. And it's the exact same thing oftentimes with galleries where you go and you're like, this is the whole show is supposedly about reflecting history. And it's so strange because they only allow people in those spaces when they basically cannot actually question the status quo anymore. Like they will add somebody in their art institutions and whatever. Like, for example, some of those creators of zines from the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? They added them to their institutions in 2020 and beyond, right? When they are already mostly talking about their old works because they are older now. Then usually, like the older you get, the more you get responsibilities of taking care of other people, and you can't just be doing really cutting edge shit all the time. Or because, like if you survive that long, if you're like 70 years old, for example, and you were active back in the day, if you survived this long, you've probably lucked out in one way or another. Like probably your financial situation got sorted out or whatever it is, right? So by the time that they actually let those people in, those people are not a representation of the marginalized group anymore as much as they used to be. It doesn't mean that they're not a part of it anymore entirely, but they're not actually representing the cutting edge shit in the area anymore. Do you know what I mean? I've noticed that a lot of works that are actually specific about what they're talking about, that have teeth instead of being this like toothless type of, rebellion or whatever the fuck, they usually don't really get a spot in these spaces because these spaces are funded by people and made by people who have generational wealth, because that's how much money you need to have to fund something as big as a gallery or whatever, right? And when you get to know those people who are with generational wealth, where the fuck do you think it came from, especially here? Yeah. And it's not even just specific to here, obviously, because you just can't have this type of generational wealth without being someone who was a coward, who didn't say anything, without people selling their own people to the oppressors, without having some kind of dirty money involved. And like, what do we expect from people who are generationally raised to be like this? Like, you know what I mean? Anyway, when talking about this exhibition, I was surprised that it actually is well put together. However, I do not want to either say that they're exploiting or not exploiting the artists or something like that, because I don't think that they're exploiting them because they asked for permission from the actual artist to show their works. However, I do think that it's important to always ask ourselves when we go to galleries, when we go to shows, when we participate in anything, and I know it's annoying, honestly, like I understand that, but it's important to ask a question of why this particular people are here, and are they actually doing anything? Like, is this, and does it have any merit? Do you know what I mean? And merit in art is very difficult to define, obviously. However, I think that it is a combination of things that is basically a bunch of different separate categories. Like, one of the categories is the enjoyment of the audience. And I understand that some artists are not going to have any points in that particular category because they are talking about something that's not beautiful, it's not nice to look at, and other things like that. But they will have a lot of points in other, sections of merit that is basically talking about something real, difficult, something that is affecting people, making some kind of statement or suggestions for change or creating change through your works. You will get points in there. I'm not saying that if you are the type of artist who likes to focus on good things in your life, like for example, you specifically make art about love or something like that, I don't think that it's automatically bad art because you're not making it about something traumatic. That's why I'm saying that there's different categories and you can get points in each one of them, right? But oftentimes when you will go to those shows, you kind of come in and you're like, okay, so this artist were condemned, for example, by their government somewhere else, like somewhere in China, for example, or something like that, right? Now they're shown here. Why, right? Because sometimes you would think that if it was rebellious and it was condemned in some country that you are told is bad, in quotations, that you're supposed to see them as very powerful avant-garde activists and artists and whatever the fuck, right? But in reality, you have to always think about, well, who is funding the gallery that I'm in right now? Why did they think that this type of rebellion was acceptable and interesting to them? Why did they decide to monetize it? Why did they decide to show it to the public? Because if you are in the West, it is most likely that the artists that they're pushing, that are current and that are not Western, are going to be artists who are likely to be basically about nothing but provocation, or just like nothing but empty slogans, or like Ai Weiwei, for example. The West loved him until he basically said, well, I don't like imperialism. There's a lot of artists like that who get embraced by us, by the West, and get put on this like pedestal, for example, right? Or artists from marginalized groups where you see that their works are suddenly being pushed and shown in galleries and whatever, but then you look closer and you realize that the reason why they were being shown is because they are overall pushing the status quo. And then some of them are actually not happy with it because their works were used against what they actually are speaking about, because their works were misunderstood or taken out of context, or people just filled in the gaps, and they show their works being like, actually, we are the best and we're spreading freedom in the world. Ai Weiwei thinks so, you know? And then if this artist decides to specify that, no, I politically don't like you either, just notice how quickly they get dropped. Same happened with that girl who was environmental activist. What's her name? Something Thunberg. Something Thunberg, I think. Greta Thunberg, I think. As soon as she learned more and she realized what's causing this horrific decline in climate and like why climate change is accelerating, as soon as she realized why that is and she started to vocalize that, did you notice how little she's being mentioned in positive light in mainstream media now, even liberal media? Yeah. It's the same thing with artists. You're going to notice that over and over again. I mean, honestly, I think that based on the works that these guys chose, these works would still cause a ruckus nowadays because it hasn't been that long, honestly, and we're not progressing fast enough. We kind of regress every 10 years. It's crazy. I'm not sure. Let me know what you think about works like these that were made by punks and by anarchists being in galleries afterwards and being monetized by galleries. What you think about it. The show itself was pretty good. So if they're going to come to your city in the future, or if you're Vancouverite and you want to go check it out, go check it out. It's pretty good. And the things that they're showing there, they're like the actual OG zines. You can't touch them, unfortunately. But I mean, I kind of get it because they need to be preserved, and if everyone's gonna be fucking touching them and whatever, they're not gonna be in good shape at all after even a week of the show being open. In any case, I hope you're having a great day. I hope this was informative and not too all over the place because I'm like so tired for no fucking reason. I'll see you next time with another podcast. Bye.